On the coast of Syria, a scribe is baking a clay tablet in a kiln. It's a letter, and it's addressed to the king of Cyprus, and it is a cry for help. Outside the walls, his own city is starting to burn. The letter says, "The enemy's ships are here. My towns are burned. They have done evil things in my country. My soldiers are away in the land of the Hittites. My ships are away on the coast of Turkey, and the country is left to itself. 7 enemy ships came, and they have hurt us badly." We know the letter got baked because we can still read it. We are fairly sure it was never sent. Archaeologists found it in the ruins, in the oven, where the fire of the city's last day hardened it like a brick and then buried it for 3,000 years. The city was called Ugarit. It was old and rich and tied to every great power on earth. After that day, it was never lived in again. But Ugarit was not unlucky. It was not alone. Across 50 years, right around the year 1200 BC, almost every city like it, from Greece to the edge of Egypt, burned or emptied or simply stopped. An entire connected world went dark all at once, and the survivors never fully understood why. For 3,000 years, we've had one main suspect, a name the Egyptians left us. And only recently did something buried in the bones of a few dead children let us test whether that name was really the answer. It wasn't the answer anybody expected. To feel what was lost, you have to see what was there first. And what was there was stranger than people expect from the Bronze Age. Go back to around 1250 BC, not to one kingdom, but to a whole board of them, ringing the Eastern Mediterranean like players around a table. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, at the height of their wealth. In what is now Turkey, the Hittite Empire, the only power that had ever fought Egypt to a draw. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans, the warlords behind the legends that would later become the Trojan War. On the coast of Syria, merchant cities like Ugarit. On Cyprus, the copper. Down the Tigris and Euphrates, Assyria and Babylon. These were not strangers to each other. Their kings wrote letters back and forth, and we have the letters. They called each other brother. They complained about late gifts and unpaid debts. They arranged marriages between royal houses. A pharaoh and a Hittite king signed the first peace treaty in history that still survives, and then wrote to each other for years afterward like two old rivals who had finally retired. And underneath the diplomacy ran something more fragile: trade. Deep trade. The age was named for bronze, and bronze is not one metal. It's copper mixed with tin. The copper came mostly from Cyprus. But the tin, the rare half, had to come from far away, over land and sea, along routes that crossed a dozen borders. That dependence is the whole point. To arm your soldiers, to make your tools, you needed metal from suppliers you did not control, carried through kingdoms you did not rule. Every palace depended on every other. A single shipwreck found from this era carried copper, tin, ivory, ebony, glass, pottery, and goods from at least 7 different cultures, all in one hull. It was the first global world, a network, and a network is only as strong as the links between the nodes. Nobody at the table could see it, but they had built a machine that could fail all at once. The failure, when it came, did not announce itself. We can't give you a single day or even a single decade when it started. But when we lay out the destroyed cities and the dates the fire reached them, a pattern appears and the pattern moves. Around 1200 BC and the years after, the great centers start to fall. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, the ones with the massive stone walls that later Greeks thought giants had built, are burned and abandoned. Whatever writing they used vanishes with them, and Greece forgets how to read for 400 years. In the Hittite heartland, the capital, Hattusa, a city of temples and archives, is emptied and put to the torch. The empire that had matched Egypt does not fall back or shrink. It disappears from the record entirely. And on the Syrian coast, Ugarit sends its last letters, not just the one to Cyprus. There's a whole desperate exchange, kings writing to kings, asking where the enemy is. asking for grain, asking for ships. In one, a great king orders Ugarit to send help. In another, someone writes that enemy ships have been seen and the people should stay calm. Then, the letters stop because the people writing them are gone. Only one great power kept good records through the worst of it, because only one great power survived it. Egypt. In the 8th year of the pharaoh Ramesses III, around 1177 BC, the Egyptians carved an account onto the walls of a temple at a place we call Medinet Habu. It describes an enemy unlike a normal war. The text says no country could stand before them. It lists great powers, the Hittites among them, and says they were cut off in one moment. It describes a coalition coming by land and by sea, with their households and their ox carts loaded behind them, as if they were not raiding but moving in for good. Ramesses says he met them at the mouths of the Nile and beat them in a great battle of ships and won. He may even be telling the truth. Egypt survived, but it was the last thing the new kingdom would ever brag about. Within 2 generations, the pharaohs were poor, divided, and finished as a great power. The Egyptians gave this enemy a name, or rather, they gave the pieces of it names. And ever since, we have called them all together the Sea Peoples. Because a name is not an answer, it's a label on a locked box. The Egyptian walls list groups: the Peliset, the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, the Checker, the Lucca, and more. Strange names carved by scribes who were writing down foreign sounds as best they could. But who were they? Where did all these people come from, suddenly, at the same time, pouring toward the richest coasts on Earth? For over a century, that question has been a fight. Some of the names tease you with a resemblance. Shurdan sounds a little like Sardinia. Shekelesh sounds a little like Sicily. Lucca lines up with a region of southern Turkey. So one old idea says they were raiders and refugees from the central Mediterranean and the Aegean, a great mixing of displaced peoples surging east. But careful historians will stop you right there. A name that sounds like a place is not proof. It might mean these people came from there. It might mean they ended up there later and gave it their name. It might mean nothing at all, a coincidence of syllables across languages we barely understand. The honest answer, from the writing alone, is that we don't know. And there's a deeper problem, one that has quietly flipped the whole story in the last few decades. For a long time, the Sea Peoples were cast as the villains, the cause, the barbarians who broke the world. But look again at that Egyptian carving, at the ox carts and the women and the children moving with the fighters. That is not a raiding party. That is a people in flight. You don't bring your whole family and everything you own to a battle unless you have nowhere left to go home to. Which raises a very different possibility. Maybe the Sea Peoples weren't the thing that destroyed the world. Maybe they were running from something that already was. Not the arsonists, the ones fleeing the fire. To answer that, the words on the walls were never going to be enough. Egyptian propaganda tells you who the pharaoh wanted to have beaten. It doesn't tell you who these people actually were, in their blood and their bones. For that, we needed a body. And for a long time, we didn't have one that could talk. If you're the kind of person who likes a genuine historical mystery, the kind we're still solving, this channel is where I take one apart every couple of weeks. Stay with me, because the body we finally found changes the picture completely. The break came from one of those named groups, the Peliset. You may already know them under their other name. In the Bible, they're the great enemy of the Israelites, the people of Goliath and Delilah. We call them the Philistines. And unlike most of the Sea Peoples, we know exactly where they settled. A strip of coast in what is now Israel and Gaza, in a handful of cities. One of them was Ashkelon. Ashkelon has been dug for decades, and archaeologists noticed something change. Right around 1200 BC, right on cue. New kinds of pottery appear, and it looks strikingly like the pottery of the Aegean, of the Mycenaean world. New styles of building, pig bones and different eating habits. A new culture, arriving more or less overnight, sitting on top of the old local one. That looked like proof of a migration from the West. But it wasn't, not really. Pots are not people. Ideas travel, fashions travel. A few traders can carry a style without a whole population ever moving. Archaeologists had argued about it for years. Did the Philistines come from somewhere else? Or were they locals who picked up foreign tastes? Then, in 2013, they found the cemetery. The first Philistine burial ground ever discovered, just outside the old city walls. More than 200 graves. And inside the houses, from an earlier layer, they had also found something quieter and sadder. Infants buried under the floors of the homes where they had lived, in the way of this people. Bones, actual Philistine bodies. And by now, science had a tool that had not existed for any earlier generation of this argument. You can read DNA from ancient bone. Not easily, especially not in a hot country where genetic material falls apart. But it can be done. A team pulled genome data from a handful of individuals at Ashkelon, spanning the Bronze Age, before the Philistines, and the early Iron Age, just after they appear. Then they compared them. The result was published in 2019, and it was as close to a clean answer as this field ever gets. The people from before the change looked local. Their genes matched the Canaanites, the population that had always lived on that coast. But the infants from the early Philistine period, the ones under the floors, carried something new. A signal that had not been there before, a strand of ancestry that pointed across the sea toward southern Europe. The closest matches were to ancient people of the Aegean and to Sardinia and the far western Mediterranean. There it was, not in a pot this time, in a child's DNA. Someone really had crossed the water around 1200 BC and settled on that coast and had children there. The migration was real. The Sea Peoples, at least this branch of them, had genuinely come from the west. The oldest clue, finally confirmed by the newest science. It should have been the end of the story. It was the middle. Because the same study, the one that proved the migration, also found the thing nobody was looking for. Remember, there were two sets of remains. The early infants, right after the Philistines appear. And the later people, from that big cemetery, a couple of centuries down the line. Same city, same culture. Still calling themselves Philistines, still living as Philistines, still the enemy in the Hebrew Bible. So you'd expect them to carry the same foreign signal, maybe even stronger. They didn't carry it at all. By the time of the later cemetery, the European strand is just gone. Not reduced, not diluted to a trace, undetectable. Genetically, the later Philistines look like the local Canaanites their grandparents had settled among. The blood that came across the sea had simply dissolved into the coast within a few generations. The migrants were real, but there were not many of them. They arrived, they married the locals, their children married locals, and in 100 years or so, the incoming DNA was swallowed up completely. If we only had the later graves, we would never have known anyone had come at all. We would have looked at the DNA and said, these are just Canaanites, case closed. Wrong case. And yet the culture lasted. The name Philistine outlived the genes that arrived with it by centuries. People went on being Philistines long after they stopped being, in any measurable way, foreign. That is the real lesson buried at Ashkelon, and it's bigger than one city. A people is not the same thing as a bloodline. Identity, the thing that made someone a Philistine, or a Mycenaean, or one of the Sea Peoples, rode on culture and language and memory, not on a fixed set of genes. Geneticists have a quiet phrase for what they saw in that soil, a transient pulse, a mixing that comes through like a wave and then disappears without a trace. Which brings us back to the bigger question. If the migrants were relatively few, if they were families in ox carts looking for a home, then they can't have been an army big enough to break the greatest powers on Earth by force. So what did? While the cities burned, the answer was settling into the dirt, into the pollen, into the bottom of ancient lakes. While some scientists were reading bones, others were reading the climate of the exact years the world fell apart. They drilled cores from lake beds and coastal sediment in Cyprus and Syria and counted the pollen grain by grain, because the plants that grow in a wetland are not the plants that grow in a dry one. They tracked chemical signatures that record rainfall. They built a weather report for the 12th century BC, and the weather report was catastrophic. Right as the cities burn, the eastern Mediterranean dries out. This was not one bad season, or even one bad decade. The evidence points to a long, punishing drought that settled over the region and stayed, by some estimates, for a century or more, part of a climate shift that reached across much of the known world. Inside a Bronze Age palace, it plays out fast. The rains fail, the harvests shrink, the grain stores empty. Remember that these kingdoms fed dense populations through central storehouses, and remember that they depended on trade for the very metal in their tools. Hungry people stop paying taxes. They leave the land. The roads become dangerous, so the traders stop coming, so the tin stops arriving, so you can't arm the soldiers you now desperately need. Each failure pulls the next one down. The network that made them all rich becomes the chain that drags them all under. That is almost certainly what really happened. Not one enemy. A system collapse. Drought and famine hollowing out the great kingdoms from the inside, trade routes snapping. And yes, in the middle of it, waves of hungry, displaced, desperate people, some of them in boats, moving toward wherever there was still food. Raiding, because raiding was survival. The Sea Peoples were part of the story. But they were a symptom, not the disease. They were what a collapsing world looked like from the deck of a ship. The people of Ugarit, watching sails on the horizon, blamed the raiders because the raiders were what they could see. They could not see the drought or the broken trade or the slow starvation of the whole system. They just saw the fire at the gate. We only know because we can read the pollen they couldn't. So the world went dark, not everywhere and not forever, but deeply. The Mycenaeans were gone, and Greece fell into centuries we still call a dark age, its writing forgotten, its palaces empty. The Hittite Empire never came back. Ugarit was never rebuilt. Egypt lived but shrank, and never again ruled as it once had. Whole scripts, whole ways of life, were simply switched off. It would take centuries, and a new metal, iron, cheaper and more common than bronze, for a different world to grow up in the ruins of this one. And the people we started with, the Sea Peoples, the great enemy carved in triumph on an Egyptian wall, they dissolved, the way that strand of DNA dissolved into the coast of Ashkelon. A few of their names may survive faintly in the map of the Mediterranean, though even that we can't prove. They broke into the world, and then they blended into it, until there was no one left who was one of them. Almost nothing they said in their own voice comes down to us. We know them mostly from the people they frightened, except, in a way, for that first letter, the one in the kiln at Ugarit. A king feels the end coming. He writes to a neighbor for help that cannot arrive. The letter is set in the oven to harden, and before it can be carried out, the city falls. And the fire that destroys everything else bakes that clay tablet hard and preserves it and buries it and keeps it safe for 3,000 years, so that we could dig it up and read a dead man's last message on the worst day of his life. The world that letter belonged to was fragile in a way its own people never understood. A web of trade and grain and trust, so connected that when it started to fail, it failed altogether, and the people inside it reached for the nearest enemy to blame. We live in a more connected world than theirs. Make of that what you will. The tablet is in a museum now. You can go and look at it. The words are just pressed lines in clay, made by a man who was quite sure someone was coming to save him. I'm Elder Wen. If you want to stand at the edge of another vanished world with me, I'll see you in the next one.